This remains a deeply moving expression of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now. No fanfare, no trumpets, no royal processions through gilded halls, only silence. It was the first sign that something was amiss at Buckingham Palace on the evening of October 7, 2025. At precisely 7:00 p.m., the palace gates closed, the flag was lowered to half-mast, and the world's oldest monarchy seemed to hold its breath. Journalists waiting outside whispered that the king hadn't been seen all day. Courtiers avoided eye contact. Even the guards, usually statuesque in red and gold, looked troubled. Somewhere deep within the palace, a light flickered in the blue drawing room, a chamber used only for events of grave importance, funerals, deaths, and royal confessions. Inside, King Charles III stood alone. Without his crown, without regalia, just in a simple black suit, a single letter clutched in his hand. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass doors behind him. A ghost, caught between duty and despair. Aides waited outside the door, unsure if they were about to witness a royal address or a royal end. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, but carried the weight of centuries. "A time comes," he said, "when a king must acknowledge he is no longer the man his country needs." The room fell silent. This was not a rehearsed speech. It was a breakdown. The king's voice trembled, and for the first time in living memory, a British monarch wiped tears from his eyes before the cameras. No one knew what had broken him: the pressure, a betrayal, an illness, or something hidden deep within Buckingham's walls. But everyone watching felt one thing. This was not politics. It was a confession. And before the night was over, those words would ignite the greatest crisis in modern monarchy. Hours before the king's tearful declaration, Buckingham Palace had already begun to crack from within. It started quietly, as these things always do, not with scandal or shouting, but with a single envelope. A thick, cream-colored folder, sealed with the Royal Archives stamp, arriving at the palace at 2:47 p.m. marked, "For His Majesty's eyes only." No one but the courier knew its origin. The document was delivered directly to the king's private secretary, who hesitated before handing it over. When Charles opened it, he found a series of memos concerning an internal audit of royal estates. A routine procedure, or so it seemed. But on the last page was a signature he hadn't seen in years. Elizabeth R. It was no forgery. It was his mother's handwriting. An attached handwritten note from 2019, addressed to him personally, mentioned a reserve collection. A trove of historical items, letters, and family valuables kept beyond the reach of the state. Among them were references to Elizabeth's private correspondence with foreign leaders, several family heirlooms never catalogued, and something else, something obscured by a thick black bar of ink, labeled "Confidential, Royal Matter." That redaction started everything. Charles had lived his life in his mother's shadow, inheriting both her kingdom and her caution. Yet this folder suggested she had kept secrets even from him. When he summoned his private council, they could offer only one explanation. The document had surfaced from a secondary archive discovered during renovations at Holyrood House Palace in Edinburgh. Archivists had dismissed it as routine. It was not. For 2 hours, Charles sat in silence in his study, the folder open before him. He reread his mother's note again and again, trying to decipher its meaning. The phrase that haunted him most was simple yet devastating. Truth, when buried too long, becomes an inheritance. At 5:20 p.m., he requested a full report from the head of royal security. Within the hour, investigative reports poured in. Classified documents detailed that several valuable family heirlooms and letters had indeed been removed from the royal collection decades earlier and quietly transferred to private holdings for safekeeping. The files confirmed what tabloids had whispered for years. Items were still missing from the Queen's personal inventory, including some rumored to have been last seen at Ray Mill House, Camilla's private estate. Camilla's sudden revelation hit him like a thunderclap. For months, Charles had dedicated himself to the arduous mission of reuniting a fractured family and a weary public. And now, as if from the deepest recesses of the past, the specters of old secrets had risen, threatening to engulf his reign. Every instinct whispered for him to keep it buried, to follow the ancient royal creed. Never complain, never explain. Yet, another voice stirred within him, one that still remembered his mother's profound disappointment in his youth, arguing that this was precisely what had poisoned the monarchy for generations. He poured himself a whiskey and stared at the majestic portrait of Elizabeth that loomed over his desk. Her painted eyes seemed to ask one question: would he be the one to finally dare to open the truth? At precisely 6:05 p.m., Charles convened an emergency meeting of his inner circle. 5 advisors, 1 chaplain, and Princess Anne. No cameras, no Camilla, no William. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight. "This cannot remain hidden," he stated in an even voice, placing the folder on the table. "We must expose everything that has been concealed from the crown." Anne's reaction was immediate. "You will destroy the institution," she declared. Charles's voice remained calm, but held a finality. "Then it deserves to be destroyed." It was in that moment that he made his ultimate decision. This was not an abdication, not a resignation, but something far more profound. A public reckoning, broadcast live from Buckingham Palace. He intended to confess not his own sins, but the sins of secrecy that had plagued them all. By 6:47 p.m., the studio was already being prepared for the broadcast. The staff had no idea what kind of statement they were about to record. But as the king adjusted his tie in the mirror, one thought pulsed in his mind, relentless and clear. The crown was never meant to hide the truth. The sun had long since slipped behind the palace's massive walls by the time the cameras were set up in the blue drawing room. Chandeliers gleamed dimly in the fading light, casting long shadows across the gold trim and faded portraits. This was a room where monarchs traditionally appeared immortal, eternal, untouchable. But that evening, the room felt smaller, and the man standing at its center looked all too human. King Charles appeared without his crown, without his robes, just a simple black suit and a white pocket square. To those watching the live broadcast, it seemed he had shed not just the symbols of power, but perhaps the very will to carry them. The audience waiting outside the palace gates had no idea what they were about to witness. At precisely 7:30 p.m., the cameras began to roll. The king's private secretary gave a single nod, and then, for a moment, there was a profound silence, so deep that even the faint ticking of an antique clock seemed to echo in the air. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. "For many years, I have carried this responsibility with devotion and humility. But tonight, I must speak not as your king, but as a man who has reached the limits of what duty can demand." The words were simple, yet their weight fell like stones. The advisors, watching from behind the camera, exchanged uneasy glances. No one, not even Princess Anne, knew the exact words he had prepared. He continued. "The crown, as you know it, was built on centuries of silence. It has endured wars, losses, and betrayals by pretending that pain does not exist, but pain does exist, as does truth." There was a pause, long enough for viewers to lean closer to their screens. Then Charles took a deep breath. "I have learned that some truths, buried too long, do not die quietly. They find ways to rise through us, through history, through the very walls of this palace tonight. I cannot continue to serve while this silence remains unbroken." The words "cannot continue" landed like a thunderclap. In the press room, journalists gasped. Outside, the crowd whispered in disbelief. Across the nation, living rooms fell silent as a BBC banner flashed. "Breaking news. King Charles addresses the nation." Charles briefly lowered his gaze, then looked directly into the camera, his eyes moist but firm. "This is not a moment of shame, but a moment of reckoning. The monarchy must no longer be a shield for secrets. And if stepping aside is what it takes to restore trust, then I do so willingly, with love, not resentment." There it was, the word no one expected to hear. Stepping aside. The control room froze. Advisors signaled to cut the broadcast, but the king raised a hand, indicating for them to let him finish. I know this news will bring uncertainty. Some will say, I am abandoning my duty. Others will understand that duty, when performed for too long, begins to consume the person who bears it. I do this not to weaken the crown, but to save it. He paused again, exhaling as if he had held this truth inside for decades. Outside, beyond the palace's grand gates, the space had transformed into a dazzling sea of flashing lights and camera flashes. Throngs of people pressed forward, eager to catch every word spoken. And across the globe, from bustling New York to romantic Paris, from sun-drenched Sydney to vibrant Manila, millions of eyes were glued to screens, watching as the man once considered the most untouchable in the British Empire broke his own long-held silence. Back within the palace walls, Charles's final words left the entire room in a profound stupor. History itself will judge what all this means. For me, it is simply the closing of one chapter of life, and the beginning of an entirely new one. With those words, he slowly stepped back from the microphone. The cameras turned off one by one. The bright lights gradually dimmed, and for the first time in 75 years, the blue drawing room plunged into an absolute deafening silence. What was to follow would shake not only the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace, but the very fundamental idea of monarchy itself. The cameras finally stopped recording at precisely 7:28 p.m. The blue drawing room, a moment ago the witness to a historic event, now resembled a crypt. The film crew began to pack up their equipment in an atmosphere of uneasy quiet, their faces pale from the experience. The king had spoken for less than 20 minutes, yet his words had already spread across the world like wildfire. When the last cameraman left the room, Charles remained standing in the same spot, staring intently at the empty chairs where his advisors had recently sat. A faint scent of candle wax, mixed with the smell of nervous tension, subtly hung in the air. Portraits of former monarchs loomed above him: the stern Victoria, the reserved George VI, the majestic Elizabeth II, each depicted at the zenith of their power, each now like a silent reproach. For the first time since childhood, he felt utterly alone. The door behind him creaked open. Princess Anne entered the room, her heels muffled by the soft carpet. She closed the door silently and remained quiet for a few seconds before speaking softly. "You do realize what this means, don't you?" Charles didn't look up. "I suppose so. They will twist it. They will say it was weakness." He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "They always do." Anne moved closer, her face impassive, though emotion clearly touched her voice. "Mother never wanted this. She believed the monarchy should bend, but never break." He finally turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion or strain. Then perhaps she was wrong. For a long moment, nothing was heard in the room but the steady hum of the chandeliers. Then, in an almost broken voice, he added, "All my life, I tried to be the king she envisioned, but I was never built for this world of marble and mirrors." Anne's expression softened. "You were built for something more fragile." He gave a bitter laugh. "And that's the crime, isn't it? To feel too much." He sank into one of the velvet armchairs, rubbing his temples with tired fingers. "I thought I could bear it. I believed I could be a bridge between ancient tradition and harsh truth, but all I did was stand still while the world rushed forward." Anne hesitated before gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "The crown will survive this. It always does." Charles shook his head. "Perhaps it shouldn't." Before she could reply, Camilla entered the room, her face drawn and pale, her eyes anxiously surveying the space. She had watched the broadcast from another room, hidden from the public, surrounded by aides who didn't know whether to comfort her or avoid her. Now she looked at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. "You actually said it?" she whispered. "You told them." Charles met her gaze. "I had to." Her composure cracked. "Do you think honesty will save you?" No, it never does. Anne tensed, but Charles's voice remained calm and even. Perhaps it won't save me, but perhaps it will save what is left of us. Camilla moved closer, her voice trembling with emotion. You've exposed every weakness this family tried so hard to hide. They will tear us apart for this. He looked at her with deep sadness. They already have. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, both fell silent. The sound of rain beating monotonously against the palace windows filled the quiet. Then, softly, Camilla said, "You always carried too heavy a burden on your shoulders, but this should have been ours." Charles slowly stood, taking her hands in his. "I carried it for both of us, but I can no longer." These words finally broke her composure. Her lips trembled. "Then what now?" He gently, almost reverently, released her hands. "Now we face what we built, and what we lost." Beyond the door, barely audible, aides exchanged agitated whispers. The world outside Buckingham Palace's majestic walls seemed to be ablaze. At the very gates, protesters gathered, candles flickering in their hands, their placards proclaiming, "Long live truth," and "A people's monarchy." Others, conversely, demanded immediate abdication, their loud chants echoing across the mall. William, who had arrived just minutes earlier, listened intently to his advisor's instructions. He wished to see his father immediately, but had been told to wait. He disobeyed, however. He burst into the room without warning, still in his evening coat. "You could have warned me," he said in an icy tone. Charles slowly turned to him. "If I had, would anything have changed?" William's eyes blazed with righteous anger. "You jeopardized everything. Trust, the institution, the future." Charles's voice remained surprisingly calm and measured. "The institution will survive. It always does. But if it survives without honesty, it survives as a lie." "Honesty doesn't hold nations together," William cut in sharply. "Leadership does." Anne stepped between them, her tone sharp and unequivocal. "Enough. Now is not the time." But Charles's next words silenced them both. "It's not about the monarchy. It's about the man beneath it, and I am no longer going to pretend he doesn't exist." No one uttered a word. The rain beat harder against the window panes, intensifying the oppressive atmosphere. Camilla turned away, clutching a handkerchief. Anne crossed her arms, trying to hide her welling tears. William stood frozen, torn between fury and pity. Then Charles walked to the window and gazed at the crowd below. Thousands of shimmering lights under the gray, somber London sky. "Look at them," he murmured. "They don't need a king. They need a conscience." "You gave them both tonight," Anne whispered. He didn't reply. His reflection in the glass showed a man stripped of regalia, stripped of protection, simply a father, a husband, and a soul trying to breathe under the weight of a golden crown. As the Westminster bells chimed 8 times, the world outside continued to roar. But inside the blue drawing room, King Charles stood still, and the tears he had held back for so long finally flowed freely. And for the first time in 75 years, Britain's monarch wept not out of duty, but out of newfound freedom. By dawn, London was steeped in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, as if the very air grieved what had transpired. The rain had not ceased since the king's historic speech, and the faint gray light breaking over Buckingham Palace did little to alleviate the tension that hung over the entire city. Every news channel in the world broadcast the same shocking headline: "King Charles steps down. Monarchy in crisis." Outside the palace gates, crowds grew by the hour, their ranks swelling. Some came to express their support for the monarch, while others demanded accountability and explanations. They brought candles, flags, handwritten letters, and photographs of the late Queen Elizabeth II, her image seeming omnipresent. Someone even played the national anthem on a violin, its trembling, mournful notes swallowed by gusts of wind. But this was not the jubilant crowd of a coronation, filled with joy and anticipation. This was a nation unsure whether to mourn what had happened, or, on the contrary, to applaud. Across the Atlantic, a carefully worded statement was released by the White House, expressing respect for His Majesty's personal decision. Commonwealth nations scrambled for new direction, their future seeming uncertain. In Canada and Australia, sharp questions arose overnight. What did this mean for their own constitutional ties to the crown? Could the monarchy still lead a world it seemed to no longer understand, having lost touch with modern realities? Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal court was in a state of complete chaos. Advisors moved like ghosts through the corridors, exchanging whispered news that no one wanted to hear, but which was inevitable. One aide described the scene as the quietest panic in royal history, where everyone acted with maximum restraint, but the tension was palpable. The king's private secretary desperately tried to manage the global press storm, but the phone calls were endless, each bringing new questions and demands. Meanwhile, in a private wing of the palace, Camilla sat in silence, broken only by the flickering television. On screen, endless expert commentators dissected every word, every tear, every breath of her husband's address, analyzing it from various angles. They called it a moment of reckoning, a carefully calculated retreat, and even a royal collapse. But no one saw the woman sitting alone in a blue silk robe, looking at the ring on her finger, her thoughts deep and hidden from prying eyes. Anna, always pragmatic and decisive, took charge of the crisis meetings, demonstrating her inner strength. "We must act quickly," she told the assembled advisors, her voice confident. "Either we frame this as a transition, or we lose control of the narrative, allowing for undesirable interpretations." "Transition to what?" someone present asked, voicing the general bewilderment. Anna looked out the window, where the Union Jack hung limply in the rain, as if reflecting the collective exhaustion. "To the next chapter. Whether we like it or not, the next chapter has already begun, and we must be ready for it." At 10:15 a.m., Prince William, avoiding the prying eyes of the press, arrived through a side entrance of Buckingham Palace. Cameras briefly caught his swift movement under an umbrella as he strode quickly, his face stern. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was he preparing to take the throne? Would his father's unexpected decision accelerate a coronation no one had anticipated so soon as... William crossed the threshold of the king's private study. The air was thick with tension. Charles sat at his desk, still in the same black suit he had worn the day before. Beside him lay a stack of unopened handwritten letters from ordinary citizens. He looked up, weary but calm. "Have you come to lecture me, or to listen?" Charles asked softly. William hesitated. "I have come to understand." Charles gestured to the chair opposite him. "Then sit, because understanding is what I failed to give my mother, and what I refuse to deny you." A long, heavy silence followed before William broke it again. "You've sent the country into shock. People are scared. They think this is the end of everything." "It is not the end," Charles said softly but firmly. "It is the beginning of truth." William frowned, expressing his disagreement. "Truth doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't hold the Commonwealth together." "No," Charles replied. "But lies won't hold it forever either." The young man sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose thoughtfully. "People need stability, Father. If you step down, I'll have to take the crown sooner than anyone expected." "Then take it," Charles said, his voice firm yet kind. "But take it for them, not for the institution. Lead differently. Lead as yourself." William studied him for a long moment, trying to grasp his true motives. "And what about you?" "I will still be here," Charles said, gazing thoughtfully out the window. "Just no longer above them. Perhaps, for once, I can finally be among them." Outside, crowds chanted his name. It was not a protest, nor adoration, but something in between, defying easy definition. It was the sound of a nation shaken to its core, uncertain whether it had lost a monarch or gained a man. News reports incessantly replayed his final phrase from the broadcast. "I do this not to weaken the crown, but to save it." Analysts worldwide debated the meaning of his words. trying to decipher his true intentions. Was he planning to formally abdicate or merely withdraw from public life, remaining king in name? The palace remained conspicuously silent, offering no comments. And yet, despite the widespread confusion and uncertainty, something truly remarkable was happening. Letters and messages began to pour in from all corners of the globe. Thousands of messages from people thanking him for his vulnerability, for showing himself to be human. One message, written by a young girl from Glasgow, simply read, "Thank you for showing us that even kings can cry." By midday, Charles read this line aloud to his advisors, his voice once again trembling with emotion. "This is the monarchy I wanted to build," he said. As the day drew to a close, the rain finally subsided, and the clouds over London momentarily parted, allowing a faint ray of sunlight to break through. It touched the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the very spot where his mother had once greeted millions of subjects. Now, Charles stood there not as a king, but as an ordinary man. And for the first time, it seemed that the crown, however fractured it might be, could finally become true, genuine, once again. The evening of October 8, 2025, arrived slowly, like a deep exhalation after prolonged tension. The storm clouds that had enveloped London since the king's address began to dissipate, revealing streaks of fading sunlight over the majestic Buckingham Palace. The mood inside, however, was far from calm. Rather, it was tense and expectant. The monarchy stood on the brink of a profound transformation, and everyone within those walls was acutely aware of it. The royal court was preparing for what aides delicately called the signing. This would be the first time since Edward VIII in 1936 that a British monarch officially stepped back from the throne. But this time, there was no scandal, no abdication for love, no exile. This was something quieter, more deliberate, and more profound. King Charles III would remain king in name, but would transfer his day-to-day powers to his heir, Prince William. At 9:15 p.m., a group of high-ranking ministers, members of the Privy Council, and the Archbishop of Canterbury gathered in the Green Drawing Room, just steps from where the historic broadcast had been made the day before. The room glowed by candlelight, its soft flames casting whimsical shadows, and the air was thick with tradition and a peculiar disbelief in what was unfolding. Charles entered without ceremony, his movements devoid of the usual regal formality. Gone was the stoic royal composure that characterized his youth. His steps were slower, his posture seemed heavy, yet resolute. He took his place at the mahogany table, where the royal documents awaited him. The top page was adorned with the crest of the House of Windsor, a symbol of centuries of dynasty. Opposite him stood William in full military regalia, his expression unreadable, like a mask. The Archbishop gently cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Your Majesty, the Council recognizes this as an act of will, not compulsion. Are you ready to proceed?" Charles nodded once, confirming his readiness. "I am." He reached for the quill, hesitating only briefly before signing his name. Charles R. The scratch of ink on parchment echoed through the room, followed by the measured ticking of the mantel clock, counting the moments of history. When the signature was complete, he set down the quill and looked at his son, as if passing the torch. "It is yours now," he said quietly but firmly. William said nothing in return. He simply bowed his head, expressing his consent and acceptance. For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence was reverent, almost sacred, filled with the awareness of the moment's magnitude. Then the Archbishop stepped forward, his movements measured and solemn. He handed William the crucial document that officially confirmed him as Prince Regent. This title granted him the exclusive right to act on behalf of the crown, signifying not the fall of the monarchy, but its irreversible transformation. Anna was the first to break the tense silence. "The line continues," she murmured, her voice a mix of pride and humility. Charles gave her a faint but understanding smile, confirming, "As it should." The ceremony concluded without the usual fanfare. No tumultuous applause, no majestic anthem, no lavish spectacle. Later, Those who witnessed this historic moment called it the quietest revolution in centuries of British history. Late that same evening, Charles walked alone across the palace courtyard. Soft circles of light, cast by ancient lamps, fell upon the cobblestones, and in the distance, as if counting a new era, Big Ben chimed 10 o'clock. He stopped at the edge of the fountain, gazing at his reflection, which rippled slightly on the water's surface. For the first time in decades, his thoughts were not occupied by duty, public opinion, or his own legacy. He felt only a deep sense of peace. Slowly, almost gently, he removed his signet ring and turned it in his hand. The gold of the ring gleamed dully under the lamplight, engraved with the royal crest, a symbol uniting all monarchs before him. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he slipped it into his pocket. Meanwhile, inside the palace, William was already immersed in work, receiving instructions from numerous aides. He was to address the nation at dawn, carrying a message of unity and unwavering continuity. Camilla, preferring quiet solitude to public spectacle, prepared to leave Buckingham Palace for their private residence in Wiltshire. As Charles returned across the courtyard, a group of palace staff stood respectfully at a distance. As he approached, they bowed their heads, a bow not of protocol, but of genuine gratitude. He merely nodded slightly in return, his voice barely audible as he murmured, "The crown will endure, but tonight, it can finally breathe." And somewhere beyond the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace, the people of Britain, those who rejoiced, those who wept, and those who simply watched in awe, realized they had witnessed not the fall of a king, but the rebirth of a man. The next morning, London awoke to a strange, unfamiliar calm. The sky was painted in pale golden hues, and for the first time in days, the curtain of rain had lifted. Crowds still gathered near Buckingham Palace, but anger and outrage had given way to quiet, thoughtful contemplation. The monarchy had not ceased to exist. It had simply undergone a profound evolution. King Charles was no longer the man the world knew. The crown still bore his name, but the weight of its burden had been lifted. This morning, he spent not in a lavish gilded chamber, but walking alone through the palace gardens, listening to the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. The roses, as if in defiance, had begun to bloom again, having bravely weathered the recent storm. He stopped at a marble bench where his mother had once sat during her last summer. For a long time, he remained silent. Then, with a faint smile, he whispered, "It's lighter now." This moment, simple, profoundly human, and vulnerable, reflected the true meaning of his reign. It was not about titles, immense wealth, or elaborate ceremonies. It was about the courage to let go of what had become too heavy to hold. For decades, he had been a man waiting to be king, only to realize that the true form of leadership is the ability to know when to step back and allow others to rise. Perhaps this is the lesson this story leaves us with. Power itself does not make a person great. Greatness is born of self-awareness. Sometimes the strongest thing a leader can do is admit that they are still human, still imperfect, still learning. As William prepared to usher in a new era of monarchy, Charles turned away from the palace gates. Without a crown on his head, without the ceremonial anthem that usually followed him, he embodied only the quiet dignity of a man who had finally found inner peace.